For sure, you won't make it down the hill without going into the snowman. The snowman. For sure, you won't make it down the hill without going into the snowman.
That's music by the Canadian composer Derek Chark, and a piece called Cercle du Nord, number 3, North Circle, number 3. And it's a Canadian composer looking to the Arctic Circle and the Inuit people there, incorporating the sounds of the Kronos Quartet, along with the recorded sounds of voices from an Inuit village, human and canine alike, and the sounds of traditional Inuit throat singing. That kind of weird rhythmic effect is created usually by the women of the village. They will pair off and sing into each other's mouths, using the other person's mouth as a resonating chamber. The pieces usually don't last too long because after a minute or two the women dissolve into a fit of giggles. You hear that a lot in traditional recordings of Inuit throat singing, and you hear it finally at the end of this piece by Derek Chark. Cercle du Nord, number 3, on this edition of New Sounds. In a moment, the American cellist David Darling takes a musical journey to the highlands of Taiwan to meet the Wulu Bunun people, who have a style of choral singing that stunned Western musicologists when they first heard it. You'll hear it in just a moment. Next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour, high school students reimagine the presidential primaries right down to the campaign ads.
C to the A to the R-L-Y. Vote Carly Fiorina, I'll tell you why. She's not gonna fill our nation with any more problems. Unlike her opponents, she can actually solve them.
It's a political campaign story unlike any you've ever heard before. Next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour. Saturday mornings at 10 on 93.9 FM.
WNYC received support from Fox Searchlight Pictures, presenting the new film Youth, from the director of The Great Beauty, and starring Michael Caine, Harvey Keitel, Rachel Weisz, Paul Dano, and Jane Fonda, in select theaters tomorrow. Helen Keller International, a nonprofit dedicated to saving the sight and lives of children and their families in 22 countries, including the U.S. A brighter future is in sight. Learn more at hki.org.
Don't forget to check us out online at newsounds.org for playlists that tell you what's on each program, our audio archives. You can hear any show anytime, and subscribe to our free podcasts and take New Sounds with you. Details on New Sounds live events, ways to connect with us on the ever-increasing number of social media, all available at newsounds.org. Let's listen next to music from David Darling, the American cellist, and the Wulu Bunun, the people who live, the Aboriginal inhabitants of the Central Highlands of Taiwan. They have developed a kind of choral technique that they call pasibutbut, which is this really sophisticated, long kind of glissando or slide up the scale, at the same time that it's also a growing crescendo, getting louder. It's a really striking effect. I mean, it's the kind of thing you would expect from modern classical music in the mid-20th century, for example. But here's this, relatively small group of people living in a relatively isolated part of Taiwan, and they've developed this style of music. And David Darling, once the chorus is in full flow and in full flower, adds a second chorus of multi-layered cellos, which brings the piece to a beautiful conclusion. It's called Pasibutbut. It's David Darling and the Wulu Bunun on New Sounds. two choirs of a sort. The choir of the Wulu Bunun, the Aboriginal people of the highlands of central Taiwan, and then this instrumental choir of layered cellos from David Darling. From their collaborative record called Mudanin Kata, this piece is called Pasibutbut, this amazing long glissando/crescendo. David Darling and the Wulu Bunun wrapping up this cross-cultural edition of New Sounds. I'm John Schaefer. Thanks for being with us.
An issue for the nation from the policing scandal in Chicago. Who controls video recorded by police?
I think the police department can control it. I mean, when the district attorney or whoever wants evidence, you subpoena it.
Former Police Commissioner Ray Kelly on The Brian Lehrer Show. Next time, a Bronx public defender argues a neutral office must keep those videos. Also, Mayor de Blasio will join us live. The Brian Lehrer Show, weekdays at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
WNYC is supported by LV Wood, manufacturers of bespoke wood flooring. Bespoke wood floors are made to order and are all made in the USA. The New York showroom at 24 West 20th Street is open to the public. More at lvwood.com.
This is WNYC, FM and HD New York. Just keep listening.
I'm Leonard Lope. The recent mass shootings have reignited the gun control debate. On today's show, ProPublica reporter Lois Beckett sheds light on an often overlooked piece of the puzzle, that the shooting deaths of black men are what drive the highest rate of gun murders. And then we'll discuss the new British production, the Young Vic production of Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge, with the three leads. We will explore the rise of solar power in the United States and also find out how much it's going to cost us to curb greenhouse gas emissions. That's what's coming up after the news. This is WNYC, WNYC.org. Stick around.
From NPR News in Washington, I'm Shay Stevens. The FBI is still searching for the motive behind the mass shootings that left 14 dead and 21 others injured Wednesday in San Bernardino, California. The attackers are identified as husband and wife Syed Farouk and Tashfeen Malik, both killed in a shootout with police hours later. San Bernardino Police Chief Jared Bergwan says Farouk worked as an inspector for the agency throwing the party where the massacre took place.
The suspect was in the room during the early part of this meeting or party type event. It was a county public health Christmas holiday type gathering luncheon is what it was. He was part of that. He was there early on and he left.
Witnesses have told police that Farouk left the party angry and returned with his wife and assault gear. A search of the couple's home uncovered 12 pipe bombs and more ammunition. The SWAT team commander in San Bernardino says officers were at the scene of the massacre within just a few minutes because they happened to be training nearby for a multiple shooter attack. NPR's Martin Costi reports.
Lieutenant Travis Walker calls it a stroke of luck that he and his officers were near the site of the massacre on Wednesday morning.
We had just finished a training scenario that involved multiple shooters at multiple locations within a small confined area.
That's when they got the report of a real multiple shooter situation at the nearby Inland Regional Center. They were there in minutes, too late to stop the massacre, but quick enough to help the wounded. And the reason that the SWAT team was training that day? Walker says it was in response to last week's shootings in Colorado Springs. Martin Costi, NPR News, San Bernardino.
Some experts brought together by the White House and the Justice Department are trying to find answers to a problem that Attorney General Loretta Lynch describes as the criminalization of poverty. NPR's Joseph Shapiro explains.
The meeting in Washington brought together judges, lawyers, and academics. At issue is the way states and courts tack on so many fines and fees to minor offenses like traffic tickets. Sometimes poor people can't pay, and when they don't, there are late fees. And even, as Attorney General Lynch noted, the threat of going to jail.
In a country where we have ruled that debtors' prisons are unconstitutional, too many of our citizens are simply in jail because they don't have the money to get out. In America,
An NPR investigation last year found that in most states, people can get billed for things that were once free or even for things that are constitutionally required, like a public defender. Joseph Shapiro, NPR News.
On Asian stock market, shares are lower, down 2% in Tokyo following a weaker than expected stimulus move by Europe's central bank. U.S. shares fell more than 1%. This is NPR News. An industry trade group is challenging a New York City law requiring salt warnings on some restaurant menus. The National Restaurant Association contends the city's health board overstepped its legal bounds and is infringing on free speech rights. The new law requires some chain restaurants to place a salt shaker icon next to menu items containing sodium amounts that exceed the recommended daily limit. It went into effect on Tuesday. California Supreme Court has ruled that food products cannot be labeled and sold as organic if they contain any non-organic ingredients. Capitol Public Radio's Ben Adler has details.
The case involves a food producer named Herb Time Farms, which grows mostly conventional herbs, but has one farm that's been certified organic. The company processes the herbs at the same facility and sends blended conventional and organic products out under the Fresh Organic label and packaging. A California consumer filed a class action suit saying she paid more for the herbs because she believed they were 100% organic. The company argued that it's been authorized by federal officials to use the organic label and that federal regulations preempt state law. Two lower courts agreed, but the state Supreme Court unanimously overturned those rulings, saying companies cannot label a food product organic if it contains any non-organic ingredients. For NPR News, I'm Ben Adler in Sacramento.
In college basketball, UCLA has beat Kentucky 87-77 for the Bruins' first victory over a top-ranked team since 2003. I'm Shay Stevens, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Dropbox, offering Dropbox Business with added administrative features and security controls designed specifically for businesses, enabling teams to work together on any file from anywhere. More at dropbox.com/business.
You're listening to a rebroadcast of the Leonard Lopate Show. You can also join us weekdays at noon to hear the show live on 93.9 FM and AM 820, also WNYC.org.
You're listening to the Leonard Lopate Show on AM 820 and 93.9 WNYC.
For the past 15 years, an upsurge of seemingly random deadly mass shootings has touched nearly every corner of the United States, and a front-page piece in today's New York Times notes that there's been more than one mass shooting per day this year alone. This stream of shocking events has intensified the debate over the accessibility of powerful firearms, but has the discussion provided a true understanding of gun violence in this country? In a recent article called How the Debate on Gun Control Ignores Black Lives, Lois Beckett, a reporter for ProPublica, reveals how gun deaths affect our cities and how they disproportionately take the lives of black men. It's available on ProPublica.org. We have a link to it on our show page at WNYC.org. And it brings Lois Beckett to our show today. Hello.
Thanks so much for having me on.
There's still a lot that's unclear about the circumstances involved in yesterday's event at the Disability Support Center in San Bernardino, California. But from what we know so far, is this an exception to what you're writing about?
So the San Bernardino shooting is terribly tragic, and if you look specifically at these kinds of shootings, public active shooter situations as law enforcement call them, some studies have suggested that they're on the rise, that there are more in recent years than there have been before. But that's a growth from a pretty small number to another pretty small number. The FBI's definition put the average in the first half of the 2000s at 6 of these active shooter incidents per year. Now it's growing to 16. The way we get to a statistic like 355 mass shootings a year is by using a pretty vague definition of any shooting in which 4 or more people are shot. And that just captures a lot of very different kinds of gun violence, including, of course, a lot of things that are actually categorized as urban violence, if we're thinking about them in that way.
When President Obama spoke about yesterday's shootings, he pointed out that even people on the no-fly list are able to legally buy guns. Is it easier for people to buy a gun than to get on an airplane?
That's certainly a line that advocates of gun control often use, the fact that if you buy a gun from a licensed gun dealer, you have to pass a background check that might flag people with criminal records, but that if you buy it from a private seller, you don't. And so that's a serious loophole in the federal law, and one that many people want to close.
Has our focus on gun deaths and mass shootings been a distraction from other kinds of gun deaths?
If you look at the policies that are pushed in Washington, absolutely. Thinking about today's San Bernardino shooting, the assault rifles that appear to have been used in that, these kinds of mass shootings and the focus on them drove a federal ban on assault weapons starting in 1994. But it turns out that military-style rifles just aren't used in the majority of gun murders. So by banning them, we didn't end up saving that many lives. That kind of policy is not helpful if what you want to do is save as many lives as possible.
California has some of the strictest gun control laws in the country. Has that affected the number of gun deaths in California?
Yes, advocates would say that California has seen a sort of stronger decline in gun deaths compared to other states. But the hard thing is that it's easy to take guns across state lines, and so just looking at tough gun laws in one state or in one city doesn't capture how easy it is for guns from Indiana, for instance, to come into Chicago, despite Chicago's strict gun laws.
You say that in a city like Oakland, where there's been a lot of gun violence, there may be only around 50 to 100 people at high risk of either shooting or being shot. So how does that result in so many deaths per year?
So that's 50 to 100 people at one time who are at most high risk. Experts who worked with the police department to map out found about 1,000 to 1,200 young men who were sort of at general risk of driving this violence, which is about 0.3% of Oakland's overall population. So the people who are at risk are extremely high risk of being shot. They're extremely high risk of dying, and they're putting whole neighborhoods at risk, but it's actually not that many people.
When we talk about mass shootings, mass killings, are we talking about things that involve African Americans?
Again, this whole definition of what a mass shooting is extremely debated. So
we're debating whether terrorism should be applied to this or to the Planned Parenthood shooting.
Exactly, and I think part of the essential problem here is that when we look for a definition of mass shooting, we're working backwards from what the media covers, what shocks people, what gets attention, to some definition of shooting, rather than looking at actually who is dying, where this murder is happening, and having that drive the media coverage.
And why do you think we don't see more discussion of the other murders, the larger number of murders? Because they're just one at a time, or because they involve minority groups?
There's a lot of different perspectives on that. Certainly the fact that there are fewer numbers of people, that they're less shocking, that they're less surprising is part of it. Race, many people think, is part of it also. And the fact is that the mass shootings that frighten us are things that seem to happen randomly, that could happen to anyone, and that makes everyone afraid. Whereas much of other violence is confined by race, is confined by geography, is literally segregated away from the rest of us, and doesn't put a lot of people at risk.
You mentioned Chicago. Isn't Spike Lee addressing the situation in Chicago with his new film, Chirac?
I don't know how well that film is actually going to tackle it. Part of the problem here is that the understanding of what violence means and the cultural frameworks that we have for looking at it don't help us understand the actually incredibly concentrated and data-driven nature of this, that even if you look at Chicago, again, like Oakland, it's a very small percentage of people that drive minutes. And what puts you at risk is not just being in Chicago, or even being in what might be considered a high-violence neighborhood in Chicago, but for the people and friends of people that are putting you at risk.
In his film, the plot of Lucas Strata, where women decide to withhold sexual favors from men.
It's particularly true of the number of households as a percentage of total households that report ownership. Now, one of the reasons for that is that a lot of the growth in households are households headed by females. And the first thing to know about handgun ownership in the United States is that it almost always involves the XY chromosome. Male
So you're
race,
saying more men?
Yeah. much more. And so the problem with saying, wow, our declines in homicides are associated with increases in gun ownership and use, is that we haven't had the increases in gun ownership and use. And I would also point out that even at our near historic low, we're 5 times the UK rate. The mass violent phenomenon is not closely linked to the rates up or down over time in garden variety homicide.
What might be going through the mind of people who hear this and say, well, that then implies that the authorities really can't do anything about mass shootings?
At the margin, you can still prevent lots of them, but not all of them. In our school shooting experience, for instance, when you have something like Columbine in 1999, and you have older students, and you have them cooperating and planning and acquiring weapons over long periods of time, that's going to be pretty tough to interdict. But when you also have 12 and 13-year-olds coming alone to schools with guns that they got from their grandfather or stole, that's going to be easier to interdict.
Criminologist Professor Franklin Zimri.
And borrow this text just in from Vamian in Philadelphia in the US, who says gun violence is making many people here very afraid. We wish gun laws were revisited to minimize casualties across America. Now, for those who cherish the dream of European unity, the Schengen Agreement is one of the more practical applications of that ideal. Signed more than 30 years ago, it created a passport-free travel zone within the European Union. But the agreement seems to be cracking at the seams under threat because of pressure created by the migrant and refugee crisis. That's led several EU states to temporarily reinstate some forms of border controls. EU interior ministers meet today in Brussels to discuss the issue. But a leaked document suggests they could be considering a 2-year suspension of the Schengen Treaty. Steve Pearce, who specializes in EU law at Essex University here in the UK, has seen that document. So what does it say?
Mainly it says there's a plan afoot to suspend the whole of Schengen, potentially, or at least many of the parts of Schengen, and just reimpose border checks because of the continuing refugee crisis and the way that it's managed by Greece, with the large numbers of people coming onto Greek islands.
To suspend for how long?
Well, it would be up to 2 years, because that's what the rules allow for if they're being applied correctly, and they'd have to review it every 6 months. It can ultimately be up to 2 years.
Presumably, there's something within, EU treaties which allows for this sort of measure to happen. What are the conditions?
Well, the conditions are that there's pretty fundamental defect in control at the external borders, and the argument is that the fundamental defect is the fault of Greece, because it's not dealing with the numbers that are coming onto the territory very well, it's not getting enough EU help, and so therefore the justification provided for by that is that there can be continued suspension of Schengen up to 2 years.
So Greece, the finger being pointed at Greece, not at other EU member states, because a lot of them have taken moves to put the borders back in place anyway.
That's right. A lot of them haven't reimposed the borders, but the argument, it's one member state that's responsible for a serious deficiency, and so of controlling the external borders, and then as a result of that, other member states can reimpose internal border checks.
I know you're a legal specialist and not necessarily a diplomatic or political specialist, but there'll be some people who don't like Schengen anyway who'll be whooping for joy, and some people will be saying, this is the beginning of the end of Schengen.
If it does go on for up to 2 years, there's time to do a lot of things in the meantime to introduce new rules on fingerprinting people at borders, for instance, to make sure that more people are fingerprinted. The EU has a recent deal with Turkey that will be up and running well within that 2-year period. So things can certainly change. Maybe that's the thinking, that it won't be long, and then Schengen can be resumed.
Is it an acknowledgement that the scale of this migrant and refugee crisis has really underlined perhaps some of the fault lines of this Schengen agreement?
What was happening before, with far fewer people coming and applying for refugee status, the system maybe didn't work terribly well, but it wasn't so obvious. Once you then quadruple the numbers, then it becomes an enormous problem, and the scale of the difficulties are obvious, and you soon run out of space in many countries to deal with the numbers of people coming in as refugees.
Just one final thing, if the agreement were to be suspended, how soon could that happen?
there's sort of two versions of this. So one is kind of giving Greece 3 months to clean up its act, and the other was kind of jumping the gun and going ahead straight away. Now, maybe Greece has done enough now to clean up its act that he won't do it, but if not, it could all happen within a few weeks.
That was Professor Steve Pears, and we've received this text, which is very pertinent considering the story we've been following this morning. One of them, Lamin Kanje's in Sierra Leone. He says, at age 12, my father was captured and shot by RUF rebels. As such, I always pitied the children of gun attack victims. The US Senate should support the proposition by President Obama to amend the gun law in America. Lamin, thank you very much for that text. Do keep them coming in. And that text comes as one of our headlines here on the BBC is that a candlelit vigil has been held in the Californian city of San Bernardino in memory of the 14 people killed when a married couple opened fire on a Christmas party. You're listening to Newsday on the BBC World Service.
And time right now to have all the latest sports headlines with Alistair Ross.
Thank you. The man in charge of football in Brazil, last year's World Cup hosts, has stepped down after being indicted by the American investigation into corruption at FIFA. The Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, says there are charges against 16 more officials in total. They expect there to be more arrests to add to the 2 high-ranking FIFA officials who were detained on Thursday. Real Madrid's president says the club weren't at fault for fielding an ineligible player in a Copa del Rey game on Wednesday that leaves them in danger of being thrown out of the competition. Florentino Perez says no one had told them that goal scorer Denis Chiryshev should have been serving a one-match ban. Rwanda and Uganda are through to the final of the CECAFA Senior Challenge Cup. Both sides won their semi-final on penalties, and the man who led South Africa to the semi-final of this year's Rugby Union World Cup is to leave his post. Henneke Meyer says it's time for a change and has asked for his contract as manager not to be renewed.
Alistair, thank you very much indeed, and hello again to Andrew Wood, who's our business correspondent in Hong Kong. And Andrew, you're talking about something that I'm very curious about: non-farm payrolls. Is that the term?
Yes, it's an awful bit of jargon, isn't it? Economists do love their jargon. Well, these are figures that basically tell you how many jobs are being created or lost in the United States, and this is the first Friday of the month, so the figures for November will be published later on today in the United States. It's called non-farm payrolls because if you include people who work in agriculture, in farms, the number of people that goes up and down and doesn't really have a lot of relation to how GDP is being produced, how economic output is produced. So these figures strip out that and tell you basically how many new jobs are being created or lost.
So why is it particularly worrying or of particular interest right now?
Well, on December the 16th, the Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, will decide whether to raise or leave interest rates alone. Now, the head of the Federal Reserve has been hinting for an awful long time now that basically those interest rates with the cost of borrowing would rise by the end of this year, and so far it hasn't. It's been sort of virtually zero since the financial crisis. This is the last monthly meeting that the Fed has a chance to do that. So look at the non-farm payrolls. If those are high, and it shows that sort of basically businesses are expanding and taking on new workers, it increases the chance that interest rates will go up, as the Federal Reserve will want to put like a tap on the brakes to make sure that growth in the United States, economic growth in the United States, doesn't get out of control, so that you don't get a boom that turns into a bust,
but if
or try to prevent it.
But if the cost of borrowing rises, couldn't that then affect those who are at the lower end of the income scale, you know, those who are on basic wage, for example?
Well, it will mean certainly that the chances are that companies will not expand as fast and will not be creating so many jobs. So yes, it's not all good. I mean, with economics as well, it's a bit like being a doctor. You know, you don't sort of decide whether somebody is fat or not if you know their weight. You have to know what gender they are, how tall they are, how old they are, to work out whether they're healthy or not. And sometimes, you know, with economic medicine as well, like medicine in humans, can have a lot of good effects, but there will always be side effects as well. Not everybody is going to benefit.
Interesting indeed. Thank you very much for at least also breaking down that definition for us, Andrew.
I'll tell you what would be interesting is to see which makes the bigger headline. December 16th, a possible interest rate rise in the US, or December 18th, that you might be down. That movie is latest installment of Star Wars Force Awakens, hitting the big screens later this month. Little is known in advance about the story, but we do know that some of the original stars, like Harrison Ford, will be in it. There are also some major new characters. Two arrivals, Daisy Ridley and John Boyega, both of them British, both aged 23. Arts correspondent Vincent Dowd has been hearing about their break into the big time.
Not so long ago, in a small screen galaxy, two performers were starting out in BBC dramas.
I love the fact that you're so trusting, but sometimes it stops you from seeing people for who they really are.
It's only a couple of years since Daisy Ridley had a small role on TV in the hospital series John Boyega.
And he's been told that there isn't a political will to combat the violence.
Yes, he was told that repeatedly by progressives in Washington after the Sandy Hook shootings. And, you know, if you ask people about that, it's hard to avoid the fact that often it's these dramatic shootings that tend to involve white people that get the most reaction from Congress.
Has there been any polling to indicate what the American public's perception of urban violence is all about?
I don't know of any polling that looks specifically at urban violence or at strategies like ceasefire. There are lots of polls that look at background checks and the assault weapons ban, but pollsters aren't asking about these programs, and there's not as much public awareness of them.
How much money has been spent on measures explicitly directed to prevent mass shootings, and how much toward programs like ceasefire?
So there's lots of different money going into different pots. One way to measure it is to look at what Congress approved for 2014, the year after Sandy Hook, and even though schools are actually quite safe in America, very few children are killed in schools. They're much more likely to die in their homes, in their neighborhoods, even in places like restaurants. Congress approved $75 million for school safety research, and about half that, $31 million, to support a whole range of different programs supporting these targeted urban violence efforts.
You spoke to gun control lobbying groups like the Brady Campaign and Michael Bloomberg's Every Town for Gun Safety. What did they tell you?
So they are very much focused on reducing everyday gun violence, and I think the best way to do that is through universal background checks, through focusing on gun laws and gun culture. And these sort of prominent national groups just haven't adopted these local strategies at all. Don't talk about them. It's not part of their conversation.
Didn't one of them say to you, it's not our lane?
Yes, that was
What's their lane? The Brady Campaign said that?
Yeah. Their lane is focusing on access to guns and trying to make it harder for dangerous people to get their hands on guns. Ceasefire is frankly focused more on the people than the gun.
But in both cases, I